Good morning. I'm Arthur Huxham, working for the Sprout in Cardiff. I'm here with Paul King. Good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, just to get started, I would like to ask you, starting at the personal level, when and how did you come to join NATO international staff? And since you have been working here, what other positions have you held before?
Sure. So I joined NATO international staff in 2007, and I started my role as NATO Review editor. NATO Review is the magazine that's been going pretty much since the inception of NATO, over 50 years. And it was a bit old and staid, and they wanted somebody to come in and make it a bit more up to date. So when I came in, it was effectively online, but it only came out 4 times a year, which obviously is a bit of a contradiction. It was full of rather lengthy articles. They were very good articles, but obviously it only attracted academic audiences. So what I did was I tried to make it more journalistic. And that was 8 years ago, and I've just moved off of that earlier this year. So you can have a look at NATO Review and see how different it is in the last 8 years. And what brought me to Brussels was a job in journalism in 2000. I was an online news editor, daily online news service, and I was the editor there. And then from there I got into the European Commission. I was a speechwriter for one of the commissioners and also for the president occasionally. And before that I had been a press officer for, I think it was 3 or 4 different commissioners. So yeah, I basically up to my knees in the Brussels stuff.
Now, speaking of NATO and, of course, the European referendum, in the context of the broader, not just the military, security and defence dimension, would the alliance be strengthened, weakened or unaffected by British withdrawal from the European Union? And how would you see a British withdrawal from the EU affect how NATO works over the long term?
Sure. Well, this is one of the areas. I'm actually the UK officer for the engagement section, so I deal with the UK in terms of the UK and public diplomacy. If they have a person they deal with, it'll be me. But again, as I say, I've just taken that on a few months ago. But this is an area where my professional opinion and my personal opinion are pretty much the same thing.
Of course. Which
is that it would be massively damaging for the UK to leave the EU. There's the obvious points that become clear immediately, such as there are regiments. Well, let's rewind a bit. In terms of the if you want to, I'm going to have to rewind further than I thought. If you want to look at NATO and the EU in Brussels, NATO is kind of seen as the more Anglo-Saxon organisation, and the EU is seen as a bit more of the continental European organisation. France and Germany are the undisputed champions of the EU. Some would say France more in terms of the ideas and Germany more in terms of the money, but we'll leave that to one side. They both recognise that this is something that is not just a nice idea, but has come out of the fact that there was 2 massive disasters in the European continent in the last century, and this can't happen a third time. The UK has been a huge beneficiary of being in the EU. You just have to look at the state that the UK was in when it joined. 3-day weeks, massive strikes. It was in a pretty parlous state when it joined the EU and benefited enormously. And there are other examples which I can draw from my memory from the time I was in the EU of Ireland and Portugal, their GDP levels. You can have a look at how they benefited. But that's not really the point here. The point that the EU benefits the UK hopefully has been made, economically that is. But what we have is something where NATO is a balance on the military and the security side. In other words, there's this kind of agreement that everything that isn't heavily into security security is dealt with by the EU. The Americans, who have military forces that have never been seen the like of which on this planet before, are the key player in terms of security. The EU can talk about security, but frankly, when it comes down to it, if the Americans aren't playing, there's no guarantee it's going to have much effect. Now, if you get the UK pulling out of the EU, not only does it weaken the UK in NATO, but it also opens up the whole kind of, okay, there is a type of bridge here. We do have the UK who's in NATO, and very pro-NATO, and we do have the UK who's in the EU and is one of the big three. I mean, I mentioned France and Germany, but basically, if you look at the newcomers who came into the EU, and that happened while I was in the European Commission, the Eastern and Central European countries, the country they look to most, if it's not America, is the UK. Poland, for example, 40 plus million people, one of the biggest members in the EU, has looked very much towards UK style of work practices, UK style of a very, again, what's called in Brussels a very Anglo-Saxon outlook, which is to say minimum regulation, maximum profit from the single market. In other words, a very kind of economic argument to make things as easy as possible. They don't look to Germany, they don't look to France for that. They look to the UK to push forward on that. Now, we all know about France in terms of regulation and the 38-hour week, and what's less known is that Germany has also a very strong social contract. It has bargaining of wages in a way that would be very bizarre to a lot of other countries, with actual workers on the board of the companies, and this done across the country. So, although Germany is a very modern country, it's very modern and still in a very different way to the UK and a lot of Central and Eastern European countries. So my point is that if you take that linking factor out, you effectively open up a whole new debate. Okay, and it's already happening. Okay, so does this mean now, if the UK is out of the EU, that we can start looking at an EU army? You know, should we start actually saying, okay, well, the biggest break on an EU army was the UK. They're gone. Mm-hmm. Let's move ahead with that. Where does that leave everybody? Much worse in terms of security is the fact that we have practical and well, let's start with the practical. You have a practical problem, which is that if you take the UK out of the EU, and I'm sure you've heard this already before, but the first thing that's going to happen, in fact, she hasn't really even waited, Nicola Sturgeon will say, okay, you're taking Scotland out of the EU. This is unacceptable to us. Scotland benefits enormously from the EU, is very pro-EU, and this would effectively be a very undemocratic way of treating the Scots, because you would be saying, you don't get a vote on this, but we're going to take you out of, well, I suppose you could say you do get a vote on this, but your vote will be completely ignored because you're in the minority. And they'd have no recourse to amend it, so the only action open to them would be to say, okay, we will have to leave the UK. If that happens, if you want to link it directly to security, what about the regiments that are north of the border? What about the facilities that are north of the border? Most fundamentally, Faslane, which is the only place deep enough for nuclear submarines to be able to berth safely in the UK. Where do we put them? People are already talking about sovereignty issues of, are those nuclear submarines, even though they're not docked in our country, is that okay that they're docked in another country? This has never happened anywhere in the world. If you have a nuclear submarine, you make sure it's in your country. This would be the first of its kind. So you have, I mean, economically, I think the argument is just Anybody who's voting for, frankly, I wouldn't call myself particularly pro-EU. Well, let me put it this way. People have asked me my opinion, and I worked in the European Commission for almost 7 years. There are 1,000 things you could do to improve that place. So don't see me as some lefty pro-EU person. I think it's a very inefficient way of running the continent. There is corruption, there is excessive regulation, there is a bureaucracy which is bloated beyond recognition, and I've never seen such a huge amount of money available from public purses. For example, the commissioner I was the speechwriter for, his budget was, admittedly over 7 years, but his budget was 54 billion euros. 54 billion euros. I mean, that's more than some states have as a yearly budget. So, there's a lot that could be improved about the EU, its institutions, the way it works. However, there is only one thing that's more stupid than staying in it, and that is to leave it. If you stay in it, you reform it from within, or you try. You highlight its inefficiencies. Nigel Farage does a very hyperactive job of that, highlighting its facilities, its weaknesses. He does that because we're in the EU. We leave the EU and there's no more Nigel Farage. We actually need people inside to say what is wrong with this. So, like I say, it's the baby in the bathwater. Leaving would not only be basically people voting for higher prices, because that's what would happen in the UK. You're looking at higher prices, longer queues, more difficult entry into markets. It's turkeys voting for Christmas. I was just looking today at the figures, and 44% apparently the FT polls still are planning to vote for Brexit, and I just can't really understand how almost half of a country can be convinced that it's in their own benefit to raise prices, to reduce freedom, and to limit market access. I can't understand how people are actually buying this narrative, but it seems they are.